Our antecedents made history, as did our regiment. Although we have been amalgamated and have successors, our history lives on. This is a report of events that happened in 1973. In this account and report by Ed Maloney and James Kinchin-White, this DVD has been narrated from the original report. Some would have heard accounts, but was that propaganda to boost egos, or to let others climb on shoulders and get elevated on their career path? Others were there. But it is important to deal with the facts, and both these authors and researchers have got the truth, not propaganda but the truth. There are characters on this footage report that have the power to tell the truth, but will they? For some it is as raw as yesterday. For others they became known as regimental heroes. There are no heroes, just men doing a job of choice to eradicate terror, by taking a known activist of terror, Bryson, out of the game of terror, and off of the streets, through the use of undercover soldiers. Soldiers from the regiment, the Royal Green Jackets, who were infiltrating the terrorist. Infiltrating them whilst on undercover operations in theatre. Those soldiers had reverted to their training. Training passed down from their antecedents, using stealth-like undercover tactics, two faces of the trained infantrymen. Getting a job done. The reward: freedom from those that threaten. However, the threat goes on and on, but those who have the experience and the training, can and do, play a vital role in the hearts and minds offensive. It's not about awards, and not having to pay tax on your pension because you have an award, but the legacy of peace. Being the bigger person and going that extra mile, the brotherhood, standing together, remembering. The truth is out there. History needs to be reported correctly. Truth is the stronger weapon.
Part 1. A misbelief corrected. An insight into early Irish Republican Army cells. Way back in January 2013, Ed Maloney and James Kinchin-White researched and wrote a lengthy article, based on British Army publications and a website, about the death of James Bryson, a famous IRA activist from Ballymurphy who was shot dead in a disputed incident in August 1973, along with Patrick Mulvaney, who was the brother-in-law of Gerry Adams. Local legend had it that the pair were killed by the official IRA, but this account makes it clear that the killers were undercover soldiers from the Royal Green Jackets Regiment who were hidden in the roof space of the house overlooking the Bullring, in the Ballymurphy. Bryson and Mulvaney were, before their deaths, slated to be key members in a new IRA cell in Ballymurphy set up by the then Belfast commander, Ivor Bell, to replace the heavily compromised and infiltrated company structure. Bell had succeeded Gerry Adams as Belfast Brigade leader after Adams' arrest along with Brendan Hughes the previous month. The importance of the incident lies not just in the deaths of two of the Irish Republican Army's most valuable activists, but in the challenge it presents to the official narrative behind the creation of the IRA cell structure. The conventional view is that cells were introduced largely in response to the setbacks suffered by the Irish Republican Army as a result of Castlereagh-style interrogations which followed changes in British security policy which, so the internal critics had it, were facilitated by the misguided ceasefire of 1975 to 1976. But this account challenges that version and shows that considerable infiltration of the Belfast Brigade by British intelligence forced an experiment with the cells on the organisation in the city long before the 1975 ceasefire was ever thought of. Back in 2013 we submitted the article to Vincent Brown's Politico website. We realised that the article died soon after when that website closed down, and very few people actually got to read the piece. In the original piece we reproduced a photograph of Jim Bryson, taken in the mortuary at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, which had been posted and shown for many years on a website associated with the Royal Green Jackets, whose soldiers had killed him. It was on display as a sort of war trophy. The appearance of the photo in our article seemed to cause as many, if not more, protests from Republicans in West Belfast than had its presence on the Army website, for predictable and petty reasons. But since we were sensitive to the feelings of the Bryson family, it only stayed up on the site for just 3 days, so regular readers had a chance to see it. It is an important historical document. Anyway, here is the original article on the Bryson incident. We hope you enjoy it. The Bryson Incident, by Ed Maloney and James Kinchin-White, the IRA in Retreat. Historians' understanding of the development of the provisional IRA in the 1970s and its transition into a smaller, leaner but more politically attuned group. The precursor of the body that endorsed the Republicans' journey into the peace process may have to be revised in the light of a recently acquired British military account of a crucial phase in the war between the IRA and the British Army. The Royal Green Jackets (RGJ) Chronicle of 1973, a privately circulated journal which includes an account of a tour of West Belfast by the regiment's 3rd Battalion during the summer and autumn of 1973, challenges a central pillar of the provisional leadership's narrative of their own rise to power. It reveals that the Irish Republican Army's reorganization into cells, credited with rescuing the organization from defeat in the late 1970s, was forced upon the group not because of a destructive ceasefire called by the Irish Republican Army's national leadership in Dublin in 1974 and 75, as the conventional account claims, but because of critical setbacks in Belfast more than a year earlier when Gerry Adams was the city's commander. The Royal Green Jackets account reveals that after a series of security force successes against the IRA in August 1973, Ivor Bell planned a massive reorganization in the city, scrapping the Irish Republican Army's cumbersome battalion and company structure and replacing it with 8 cells or active service units, each with 5 members, meaning that the active strength of the IRA in Belfast was just 32. By any measure this represented a significant shrinkage in the IRA's Belfast battle strength from the halcyon days of July, when the organization was strong enough to force the British to the negotiating table. By contrast, the accepted account, which has underpinned the rise of the current Sinn Féin leadership, says that the cell system was not introduced until 1977, in response to the setbacks caused by the 1974 and 75 ceasefire. This revelation comes alongside a graphic description, in the RGJ Chronicle, of an undercover ambush by soldiers from the regiment which resulted in the deaths of 2 prominent Irish Republican Army members, from Ballymurphy in West Belfast. One was Jim Bryson, a notorious and fearsome gunman, and the other was Patrick Mulvenner, Gerry Adams' brother-in-law. The 2 men had been chosen by Bell to be members of the new Ballymurphy cell, and their deaths were hailed by the Green Jackets as evidence that the British were inexorably winning a kind of military victory in Belfast. Their killing was characterized publicly then and ever since as a chance event, but this previously undisclosed background raises the possibility that the ambush may have been intelligence-led. The Royal Green Jackets account challenges the hitherto prevailing version of history by showing that long before the 1974-75 ceasefire the IRA was in such danger of defeat in Belfast, its most important arena, that the leadership in the city was obliged to contemplate a radical restructuring to survive. This new account suggests that attempts by the Adams leadership to put the blame on the Dublin leaders for the Irish Republican Army's woes in the mid-1970s, at least in Belfast, may at least be misplaced or overstated. While Ivor Bell planned a large-scale reorganization of the Belfast Brigade in the late summer of 1973, a series of security force successes against the IRA at that time, including the killing of Bryson and Mulvenner, forced him to scale his plans back, and instead, according to the Chronicle, just 12 cells were created. Nonetheless, this was a radical break with IRA organizational tradition, and a pointer to the pressure then facing the IRA in Belfast. The established version of IRA history dates the genesis of the cell structure to a conspiracy against the IRA leadership led by Gerry Adams, Ivor Bell, and Brendan Hughes, from the cages of the Long Kesh internment camp, from 1974 onwards. That conspiracy was inspired, according to this rendering, by an open-ended ceasefire called by the older, mostly Southern leadership. The Adams critique of the 1974-75 ceasefire claimed that the Irish Republican armies, then leaders, represented in the Northerners' demonology by Rory O'Brady and Datey O'Connell, were suckered into the cessation with false promises of withdrawal by the British, who used the time to reconfigure security policy. Special category status was withdrawn from the IRA inmates in the jails, and internment was phased out. The IUC was given primacy in security matters, and soon the police interrogation centers were producing a conveyor belt of confessions to be processed by no jury, single-judge courts, and the jails began filling up with IRA prisoners who were now treated as common criminals. The Irish Republican Army's Dublin leadership was blamed for bringing the organization to the verge of defeat, a charge that both justified the Adams-led conspiracy and produced the plan to reorganize the IRA. While there is no doubt that the Adams critique had considerable validity and that the 1974 and 75 ceasefire did enable the British to revamp security and seriously intensify pressure on the IRA, it is also evident, if the Royal Green Jackets version is correct, that the IRA in Gerry Adams' own backyard, in Belfast, was in such deep trouble that cellular reorganization was forced upon its leaders long before all this. According to the conventional narrative of this period, the cellular structure was not introduced into the IRA until 1977, 4 years later, when Adams and Bell were released from jail and other changes were introduced, including the concept of the Long War, the creation of a Northern Command, and Republican involvement in agitational politics. A transformation in the Provisionals' character that led to the growth and ascendancy of Sinn Féin and ultimately to the peace process. When Ivor Bell implemented his cellular plan, Gerry Adams and Brendan Hughes were already in jail. They had been arrested in July 1973 as they attended a Belfast Brigade meeting in the Ivy district of West Belfast, apparently betrayed by another brigade member whose work for the British was a major factor in the organization's degradation. The fact that Bell began the cellular reorganization so soon after Adams' arrest suggests that the plans were in the pipeline for some time before. Bell replaced Adams as Belfast commander, and stayed in that post until his arrest, in the spring of 1974. Brendan Hughes escaped from Long Kesh, and replaced Bell as IRA commander in the city until he was re-arrested in the early summer of 1974. Although the RGJ Chronicle does not deal with events in the IRA subsequent to the arrest of Ivor Bell and Brendan Hughes, it is safe to assume that their successors, who were loyal to the pro-ceasefire leadership in Dublin, reverted back to the brigade structure and scrapped Bell's cells. This is implicit in Brigadier James Glover's famously leaked assessment of the IRA in 1978, Northern Ireland. Future Terrorist Trends, which dates 1977 as the year in which the cell structure was brought in. Glover also describes Gerry Adams as the prime architect of the change. Part 2. The ambush in the Bullring. There were very few things that the Provisional IRA in Belfast and the British Army would agree about in the August of 1973, but on one issue they had no argument. James Emerson Bryson was a very dangerous character indeed. A controlled psychopath is how an IRA colleague described Bryson to one of the authors in 2001. A cunning, ruthless killer was the judgment of the battalion's intelligence officer with the Royal Green Jackets Regiment in his 5-page account of the ambush by his soldiers that led to Jim Bryson's death and the closing of one of West Belfast's most violent chapters in the early years of the Troubles. Bryson was only 26, when bullets fired by a soldier hidden in a covert observation post slammed into the back of his neck and mortally wounded him. But the Ballymurphy IRA activist had long before achieved a near-legendary status in the Republican community and helped make his neighborhood in West Belfast one of the toughest and most uncompromising provisional strongholds in Northern Ireland. The ambush that was to claim his life also took that of Patrick Mulvenner, whose wife, Frances, was a sister of Ballymurphy's most famous son, Gerry Adams. Her cousin was Gerry Kelly, another Ballymurphy stalwart and currently a junior minister in the power-sharing government in Belfast, who took part in the first IRA bombing of London in March 1973. At the time of the Bullring ambush, Mulvenner was commander of the Ballymurphy IRA Active Service Unit, arguably the cream of Ivor Bell's New Belfast cell structure. Although these days he disavows any connection to the Irish Republican Army, Gerry Adams became B Company's very first commander when the local unit decided in early 1970 to break with the mainstream IRA, soon known as the official IRA, and align with the newly formed breakaway group that, thanks to lazy journalism, would be dubbed the Provisionals. Formed in angry protest at the officials' failure to defend Catholic areas from Loyalist and police attacks the previous summer, and committed to the gun as the only solution to political problems, the Provisionals were a natural home for the likes of Jim Bryson. That Ballymurphy's IRA activists became so feared and fearsome in the years following the birth of the Provisionals was due in no small part to the presence in the ranks of B Company of remorseless gunmen like Jim Bryson. There was, consequently, one other thing the Irish Republican Army and the British Army could agree on that late summer day in 1973. Bryson's death was a huge blow to the Irish Republican Army, that of Patrick Mulvenner, and the wounding and capture of a third member of the Active Service Unit completed a miserable day for the Provo Command in Belfast. As the RGJ Chronicle account of the deadly ambush put it, the attack destroyed arguably the best provisional active service unit in Belfast and disposed of two of the most wanted and dangerous men in Northern Ireland. Gerry Adams' relations with Jim Bryson were by some accounts complex. He has described Bryson as a dear friend, and wrote in the first part of his autobiography, Before the Dawn, how not long before the Bullring ambush, he had counseled Bryson to keep a low profile. I had argued with him very earnestly that he needed to keep his head down. Things, after all, had changed from the time he could wander around the Murph at will, as the British would be keen to remove him from the scene. But the late Brendan Hughes, quoted anonymously in A Secret History of the IRA, had a different view. Bryson did not trust Adams because he had never fired a shot. He told one of the authors in 2001. He was such a hard bastard, and I think Adams was basically frightened of him. When Adams needed to curb Bryson, he added, he would send someone else to do the job, usually a fellow operator, for whom Bryson had respect. Bryson's reputation was well earned. He had escaped from British custody 3 times. The first was from the back of a Saracen armored car where he fought soldiers with his fists to get free. The second time was when he and 6 other Irish Republican Army internees swam to freedom through the icy waters of Belfast Lough from the prison ship Maidstone. The third time was from the underground passage that linked the Crumlin Road jail to the Crown Courthouse, using a smuggled pistol. Bryson and another prisoner, who were facing arms charges, overpowered warders, and changed into their uniforms, then made their way out of the courthouse. Bryson made it to the street and then to safety. His collaborator was caught. In the early years of the Troubles, Bryson's favorite weapon was a vintage Lewis machine gun, a relic from the First World War which was a standard issue for British forces up to the Second World War. He used the weapon to break the IRA 1972 ceasefire when he, with Brendan Hughes and a fellow Maidstone escaper, Tommy Tolan, opened fire on British troops during a confrontation in Lenadoon, in West Belfast. After his death, Ballymurphy Republicans created a wall mural to commemorate Bryson and Mulvaney. In the mural, Bryson is depicted carrying the Lewis gun, his IRA trademark. Bryson was also a feared sniper and used an Armalite rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. The British believed he killed a number of soldiers and policemen with this weapon. To this day, Bryson's memory is invoked by Republican leaders, although, in these days of the peace process, not to justify nor praise armed struggle. When the Ballymurphy mural was unveiled in 2001, Jerry Kelly told a crowd gathered to remember Bryson and Mulvaney, "None of us can speak for Jim or Paddy, and say what they would think of the situation today. But at the time they were leaders of the struggle, and they led with courage and imagination. There is nothing to say they would not have shown the same courage today." Part 3. The Royal Green Jackets. In the British Army, they have a nickname for the Royal Green Jackets. They call them the Black Mafia. Black after the color of the buttons worn on the shirts of their dress uniforms, and Mafia because of the number of senior, influential officers produced by the regiment since it was formed in 1966 from their amalgamation of elite infantry regiments that date back to the early days of the British Empire. The Royal Green Jackets Association approvingly quotes a rival complaining that the Green Jackets run the British Army, and it is hard to quarrel with that. A snapshot of senior officers in 1984 produced by the association showed that, in that year, there were no less than 12 Royal Green Jacket officers above the rank of Major General, including 2 Field Marshals, one of them Sir Edwin Bramall, Chief of the Defence Staff. The Green Jackets also had a name for producing some thoughtful and liberal-minded officers. A former battalion commander was Sir David Ramsbottom, who went on to become Britain's Inspector of Prisons, in which capacity he quarrelled with both Conservative and Labour governments over his insistence that prison should be about reform, not punishment. He was eventually sacked by Labour Home Secretary Jack Straw, a badge of honour by itself in some quarters, when he complained that his reports were being ignored, including one that protested about a woman who gave birth in chains. The commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion in the summer of 1973 was Robin Avelig, who later wrote a book about his experience in Northern Ireland, in which he questioned the usefulness of many military operations. He also had an intriguing take on informers, noting that while they were the most effective weapon for destroying terrorists, the rank of the informer in their subversive organization is of less significance than might be supposed. A relatively junior member can do enormous damage in achieving the operational destruction of the organization. There is, however, one former Royal Green Jackets officer whose name invariably evokes darker images: Sir Frank Kitson, a former commander of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Green Jackets, will always be associated with the murky side of the British military during the dying days of empire. In the early 1950s, he headed military intelligence operations in the bloody campaign against the Mau Mau, organizing terrorist-type counter-gangs to oppose them. He then served in Malaya during the war against communist guerrillas and in Cyprus during the Okan Uprising. In 1969 he spent a year at Oxford, refining ideas on counterintelligence developed in these outposts of a vanishing imperium, which were published in book form in 1971, with the title, Low Intensity Operations. The previous year he was given command of the British Army, in Belfast. 1970 was the year the Irish Republican Army's campaign began, and Kitson was able, at the very start of the Troubles, to put into practice some of his counterintelligence ideas. One was the use of covert observation posts, both to collect intelligence and to ambush terrorist activists. Kitson's emphasis on intelligence-led operations to produce contact with the enemy by 1973 universally accepted by the British Army, in its war with the Irish Republican Army, suggests that the Bullring ambush may not have been just as unplanned as it looked. The other was the creation of an Irish counter-gang called the Military Reaction Force or MRF. Specialist plainclothes soldiers formed the core of the MRF, but agents were also recruited from the ranks of both branches of the IRA, some of whom served in the MRF and the IRA at the same time. The Military Reaction Force both collected intelligence on the IRA and roamed the streets of Belfast in civilian vehicles ready to shoot or assassinate IRA targets. One initial goal of the Military Reaction Force was to capitalize on the intense and sometimes violent rivalry that existed in the early years of the troubles between the official and provisional wings of the IRA in Belfast. The two groups regarded each other as threats to their existence and rivals for popular support in the Catholic ghettos, while some of their leaders harbored personal grudges against each other dating from the acrimonious split of 1970. It was fertile ground for troublemaking. Frank Kitson would have two reasons then to heartily approve of the ambush and their Bullring, the Irish Republican Army's plan to create a network of secret cells in Belfast, had been disrupted through the use of a covert observation post ambush, known in military jargon as observation post reactive. While one consequence, albeit unintended, was that afterwards the provisionals blamed the officials for killing their two men and the two groups were at each other's throats. The truth as revealed by the Royal Green Jackets Chronicle was more prosaic and even pathetic. The official Irish Republican Army, led in Ballymurphy by Ronnie Bunting, had indeed set out to kill Jim Bryson that day, but the lone gunman who volunteered for the task developed a bad case of fright when he encountered Bryson and his team, and fled home. Nonetheless, the fallout was intense as Provo supporters in Ballymurphy pointed the finger at the officials. Fights between provisional and official IRA remand prisoners broke out in the Crumlin Road jail. There were numerous assassination bids, and it took a fortnight of diplomacy between the two groups before peace was restored. The Royal Green Jackets Chronicle, page 104, recorded the violence and tension that followed the Bryson and Malvena killings, but revealing in the process considerable naivete about the potential of the officials. The shooting of Bryson and his compatriots highlighted the increasing friction between the official and provisional wings of the IRA. The feud intensified dramatically in the Ballymurphy with a large number of shooting incidents which did not involve security forces. Both sides seemed to have designated members of the opposing Irish Republican Army wing for execution. The provisionals were firmly convinced that the officials had been responsible for the shooting at Bryson, Malvena and Aurora. In the Clonard and Beechmount, there was increasing evidence of dissension between the two factions. The official Irish Republican Army had slowly spread their insidious influence as the decimated provisionals lost more men. The officials had become highly motivated and politically aware. Their leaders are educated and probably sincere in their wish for a socialist state gained by political means. Equally, they are prepared to terrorize and, when expedient to do so, tough, arrogant men well versed in the handling of weapons and their use. They repudiate the RUC and angle strongly for a locally raised police force, namely themselves. They are a real danger, now and in the long term, to the RUC and politically, to the still shaky SDLP. In the aftermath of the Bullring ambush, provisional supporters betrayed an official Irish Republican Army's arms dump to the Royal Green Jackets. It included the grease gun that was supposed to have been used that day by an official gunman to kill Jim Bryson. The following pages have been extracted from the Royal Green Jackets Chronicle and contained the British Army's version of the Bullring shooting. Part 4. The Assessment. In its summary of the 3rd Battalion Royal Green Jackets 4-month tour of West Belfast, from the end of July until the end of November, the Chronicle devotes 2 fascinating paragraphs to the Bryson incident, in which the shooting of the Ballymurphy active service unit is placed in the context of Ivor Bell's cellular reorganization of the Belfast Irish Republican Army. They read, on the last day in August, the Bryson incident occurred, which was of such importance that it is the subject of a separate article. Undoubtedly the shooting dead of Patrick Mulvenner, the wounding and subsequent death of Jim Bryson and the capture of James O'Rourke was not only the most significant single event of our tour, but brought to a close one more chapter of the IRA campaign. History may show that the 31st of August was an important landmark in the fight for peace in Northern Ireland. The weapons recovered in this remarkable incident and the follow-up amounted to 13 rifles and pistols, including ammunition and explosives. After this event and other steady success, it was hard to resist the conclusion that the security forces were inexorably winning a kind of military victory in Belfast. If not Ulster, 6 gunmen were killed in August, bringing the approximate number of terrorists put out of action, one way and another, to 1,265, including 195 Protestants. In Belfast, the 3 provisional battalions, which were cited in the Andersonstown, Ardoyne and our own district, virtually ceased to exist. In their place the IRA tried to create small active service units, whose members would be known only to others in the same unit, and which would be directly responsible to the Belfast commander, Ivor Bell. The original Irish Republican Army's plan for 8 active service units, each of 5 men, in each of the 3 battalion areas, had to be revised because of the shortage of dependable men. The compromise of 4 active service units in each district had to be modified as a result of the level of attrition achieved by the Army and Royal Ulster Constabulary. The Ballymurphy active service unit, which had included the gunman Jim Bryson, had now been eliminated. The author of the Bryson incident, Captain Robert G.K. Williamson, was the intelligence officer for the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Green Jackets. When he retired from the British Army, he teamed up with his commanding officer, Colonel Robin Avellig, and another former Royal Green Jackets officer to set up a company specializing in the international transit of explosives. He declined to be interviewed for this article. Avellig died in 2010. The Lance Corporal who killed Bryson and Mulvenner was promoted to corporal and awarded the Military Medal. He was gazetted in 1974 for his bravery. James Bimbo O'Rourke recovered from his wounds and was convicted for his role on August 31, 1973, but less than 10 years later was free. He was briefly in IRA Supergrass. He broke during RUC interrogation, and agreed to implicate 6 colleagues in Irish Republican Army activity. But he later retracted before the case came to court. Ivor Bell went on to become IRA Chief of Staff, but he also fell foul of a Supergrass and lost his seniority in the Irish Republican Army. He later broke with Gerry Adams, accusing his former ally of moving the Irish Republican Army away from armed struggle. He was court-martialed and left the IRA for good. He has refused all media invitations to talk about his life in the IRA. At the time of writing, General Sir Frank Kitson was 86. Kitson was born in December 1926. The sniper who shot and killed Bryson and Mulvenner can be heard next on a taped interview from a TV documentary, giving his account of the incident when he and another member of the Royal Green Jackets were in a secret observation post in the Bullring, in the Ballymurphy area of Belfast.
Gun battles became part of the daily routine, but the IRA took its casualties too. This corporal, whose identity we've concealed, is a sniping instructor with another Green Jacket battalion. During one tour, he was hiding in a roof, watching the street through a slit in the tiles. Suddenly, he spotted 3 armed men. There was no room to move until his colleague solved the problem.
He just put his feet through the roof, and we knocked a big hole about 6 foot square. The whole roof went. I think I got more slate than the people that was down below would have got. And there was just me and him sitting in this big hole in the roof. Very, very, very exposed. So I got the first shot in.
Did you kill anybody?
Yeah, there was 2. Killed both of them. But the driver I killed, who died later in hospital, but the passenger had got out of the car, and whether he saw me or obviously the company had been forewarned and they were out on the ground and they'd obviously heard the shooting, he then let a burst go up the road. So I was on site and I couldn't remember aim high right, so I fired and dropped him dead.
Did you issue a warning?
No, it was too far away. It was about 175 yards away.
Shouldn't you have issued a warning before you opened fire?
I should have done, yeah. But because they were in a van and driving away with their weapons pointing at me, I was quite expecting to get, a few shots back in return. So really I fired in self-defense.
Were they members of the IRA, the 2 men that you killed?
When we got down to the van, I recognised the driver straight away because he was one of the top players. The co-pilot, or his passenger, was led on the floor with an Armalite tied to his wrist. And me and the guy were arguing about who he was. He said he was so-and-so, and I said, no, it's not. So we got out our wanted posters, a little booklet that we carried with players' photographs in it. Looked at it, he said, that's him. And he said, look, the shape of the face, the ears, and etc., etc. I said, yeah, that's him. And then that was it.
What was your reaction when you realised that you had shot dead 2 IRA men?
Nothing really. I mean, that doesn't sound sort of big-headed at all. It was, I suppose it was sort of like the adrenaline was still flowing through the body after all the excitement. Not that I was excited, but, sort of the shock, etc., etc. Actually getting down there and seeing a dead body, blood and guts, well, not guts, but blood everywhere. And there was this guy led on the front seat with a big hole in the back of his head, and he had a sucking wound to the chest. And we sent the report over there, the driver is so-and-so, the body on the ground belongs to so-and-so. And then you could hear in the background a big scream, so a big hooray.
The death toll mounted on both sides, and by the mid-70s, 250 soldiers had been killed, a number of them Green Jackets. For many soldiers, in the early days of the Troubles, the battle for hearts and minds was a joke. Frustration and anger grew as they saw their friends shot dead by men whose names and faces they knew, but whose guilt was difficult to prove. The players, as they euphemistically called. When you used to meet people in the street that you believed to be IRA men, how did you treat them?
Well, we used to give them a hard time.
How?
Just by carrying out a P-check, asking where they lived. We knew exactly who they were.
P-check?
Yeah, personality check. Just you'd come up on the radio, Mr. So-and-so address, then it'd go through the filing system. Yeah, that's him. Let him go, etc., etc. And then in those days, you used to have the stress position. Hands up against the wall, spread your legs. And if we knew they were players, then they used to get the legs kicked away and they used to slide down the wall on their nose or... We'd keep them in a stress position for 10, 15 minutes, and then if you ever put your hands up against the wall with your legs spread, but it tends to wake after about 3 or 4 minutes. Or another thing we used to do was we used to spread them on the wall, and then we used to sit underneath them, because obviously if you stop somebody, you're static, so therefore you're an easy target. So we used to spread them, and we used to squat underneath them, so that they would cover us from anybody who wanted to take a shot at us. The rest of the brick would be sort of spread around in cover, but you, the guy with the radio, you're alone with the guy that you're talking to, And if somebody decided that they want to have a shot at you, or he was there for a specific purpose to draw you into sort of like a trap or an ambush, then we used to just sort of get underneath them. They used to put them off a lot as well. They never used to like that.